Good afternoon, everybody. For me, good afternoon. For others, perhaps good morning or good evening. But welcome to this Inter-Academies Partnership webinar series. This webinar is focusing on removing barriers to mobility and collaboration. And it is one which has been proposed by the IAP board Subcommittee for Capacity Building and Development. I am a co-chair of the subcommittee and also a co-chair of the board of the Inter-Academies panel. We chose to have this topic because it's something which we've noted often, but not spoken about specifically. So the subcommittee is essentially responsible for working on IAP activities to do with capacity building and development. And very often we have heard that this kind of topic needs to be discussed. So the IAP is our overarching body. And of course, many different academies belong to the IAP. And they have in their membership from many different academics who are in very different circumstances and of course, different regions, different countries. And we know that there's a great deal of scope for all of our members to gain from sharing ideas and expertise, of course, and from hearing different views and different ideas. So the webinar theme has been proposed because we need to look at how we can do that. Scientific exchange and scientific collaboration are of enormous importance to the whole global community. But there are, of course, some disadvantages as well. So we thought to discuss those because we know that knowledge sharing and building and sharing resources as well are ways to promote academic activities. I might say that mobility and scientific exchange and collaboration are also important for students and student education, and that also sometimes brings some concerns and some challenges. So during the course of this webinar, we will be covering various different aspects of the kind of barriers that are experienced by academies and members of academies in different parts of the world, and of course in different regions within the different continents. So you will hear during this some discussion of issues around actual mobility in terms of practical things like getting visas and the costs of travel. But we will also talk about things like managing data and how one controls and protects data, but allows access where it is possible. We'll also hear about intellectual property regulations, which of course are very different in different parts of the world. And we will also hear about some of the issues around cultural differences between different parts of the world again. So I hope that during the course of this discussion, we will be able to share some of the concerns and some of the challenges that are particular to particular regions and some which are global challenges. And I hope that by the end of it, we will have a clearer idea, and I hope perhaps some approaches to dealing with those challenges. And we have some speakers who are obviously going to lead us through that discussion. So colleagues, on behalf of the Inter-Academies Partnership and on behalf of the Subcommittee for Capacity Building and Development, I again welcome you to this webinar, and I thank you for joining us, and I trust that you are going to find it very useful. Thank you. I hand over now to Dr. Sikazi Mtingwa, who is going to act as our chair, coordinator, moderator today. Dr. Sikazi Mtingwa is an administrative judge for the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission and a member of the board of international scientific organizations for the United States National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So he is very well positioned to act as our moderator today. Over to you. Thank you, Sikazi.
Thank you so much, Professor Burden, for the kind introduction. So each speaker will have 10 minutes for the presentation. So it's best, I think, if we hold our questions until the end for a more detailed question and answer period, although it may be good to take maybe 2 questions at the end of each talk, there may be some burning questions that need to be immediately answered. So we'll just do that. So the first speaker is Professor Rana Dajani, who is a professor of molecular biology at the Hashemite University in Jordan. Her area of expertise is epigenetics and biomarkers of trauma among refugees. And she is president of the Society for the Advancement of Science and Technology in the Arab world. And Professor Dajani will be speaking on the topic, removing barriers faced by women scientists in international collaborations. And I turn it over to you, Professor Dajani.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all, wherever you are in the world, morning, evening, or late at night. I'm very glad to be here with you to discuss this very important topic. I'm going to start by saying that indeed we're talking about barriers of women for international collaboration. And I want to highlight one very important point, that many times when we talk about women, especially those coming from the global south, for lack of a better term to describe the minoritized majority, as some people have described the global south, is that many of those challenges are not particular to women. They're also shared by men and women from those regions. And I want to allude to that because many times the concept that we want to help women in science coming from the global south becomes a token used by imperialism or colonialism, cultural colonialism, or humanitarian aid and development to come into other countries and use that to save the woman from herself, from her community, from her society, or from the typical thing is to save the brown woman from the brown man. And so that's why I say that the problems as women we face are very similar to what men face, and we need to distinguish that. And actually, I'll give you an example. So sometimes they talk about the lower percentages of women in science all over the world. And the assumption is that women in the Arab world, for example, are also less, similar to other parts of Europe and the US. But we know from recent statistics that actually the percentages of women in undergraduate and graduate education in the STEM fields is pretty high compared to Europe. So there's something that we are doing that is right, that we could maybe share with the world. So this is talking about also how learnings doesn't just flow one way from north to south, but it could actually flow the other way. And this is also a call for local sociologists and psychologists and anthropologists to understand certain things that are happening in the Arab world that are good, such as more women in STEM. However, the challenges that we face, both men and women in the developing world, is first and foremost lack of freedom. To express yourself. If you're going to be a scientist, you want to have the opportunity to pursue your intellectual curiosity without impediment. And this is one of the biggest problems. To solve this would mean solve the whole country's dictatorship and autocracy, which unfortunately we are seeing also happening in other places in the world, the global north, that we had assumed had freedom of speech, and now they're demonstrating that they don't for certain topics. We also suffer from lack of resources and funding, and too much bureaucracy that prevents people from actually executing the plans that they have. And just to give an example of these challenges, these are challenges that can be dealt with within, let's say, a country. But in the global south, we suffer from more challenges that are more structural. And for example, from occupation and apartheid, what's happening in Gaza and Palestine. And in order to document those so we can address them, so that women scientists in particular can solve these problems, we actually embarked on a study of different female scientists in Gaza and the Palestinian territories back in 2021, documenting what are those challenges in conducting science and international communication. And many of those were actually because of they couldn't get chemicals, couldn't get resources because of the Israeli prevention. They couldn't travel, they couldn't get visas. They couldn't even communicate amongst each others within the universities, within like 100 kilometers because of the checkpoints from the Israel apartheid. So these are important things that we need to also take into consideration as we solve for doing science, reaching out internationally, creating groups. And also, I just want to acknowledge here the female academics who have been killed in Palestine and Gaza in the last 4 months. Especially Dr. Khitam al-Wasifi, who was a physics professor who was killed with her family and her husband and her children and extended family as well. And this is a website we've created about remembering academics of Palestine so that we can honor them and help them as they rebuild their country once this war is done and justice is administered. Now we go to the important point. So what about women in particular? So if you talk about women in particular, this is a problem across the world. This is not reserved to the global South. The challenge is as women enter the workforce in science, they start dropping off when they're married and even more so when they have children compared to men. So this leaky pipeline is a big challenge across the world. And I want to address it to help women all over. And the core reason is that because we have a patriarchal system, and so the workforce as it is has been designed for men by men. And when women tried to enter that, they all tried to fit into the mold rather than saying maybe we're a little bit different, as this cartoon shows. And we are only different in 2 things as women, that we have a uterus, we carry a fetus, and we can breastfeed. And so there will be a slight difference. And the challenge is how do we make sure that as we acknowledge our biological sexual differences, that they are not being used to discriminate against us as women, as we conduct our science. And so maybe the question is, what do really women want rather than what does society impose upon them? And this could go from being a mother to being a CEO or a very high position leadership. And we must allow women not to be forced to assume one role or the other, but to have the choice to decide which one, and therefore having the freedom to choose. And this could mean that there's a kaleidoscope of paths towards success that a woman scientist can achieve. And this means that also she can change her mind within her lifetime. So this was a study done by graduates from MIT. The red line is the males, showing how they go up and plateau at 40 in their career, but for females, it's a zigzag going up even after 40. So this begs the attention to for women scientists that there should be opportunities for women beyond 40 to pursue science and pursue their passion, especially if they dedicated as their biological body pertains them to have children early on. So we go from equality to equity to liberation to finally freedom to choose what they want. And so how do we do that, right? Well, this is really nice, but Rana, what do we do practically if we go home after this webinar? So I'm going to give some solutions. One, we need more role models. And we need to write our stories. I wrote my story, 5 stars doing the impossible, to telling my story. And I encourage others to write their story so that not just women, young girls growing up have a role model, but men as well, so that they can support their women, their wives, their daughters, and their sisters. Also, it's about as you create role models for girls to grow up to want to be scientists, they need to read stories about that. So our initiative, We Love Reading, has created children's books about evolution and about energy and climate, talking about girls who grow up to be scientists from the global South as well. Then we need mentoring, because as females, we don't have the time and the capacity to meet with other scientists to talk and test our ideas and reach out to other people. And that is so important when you're doing science. So we created a mentoring program. And this is for mid-career scientists, female scientists. We do a speed dating so they get to know each other. And then they help each other on a personal and professional way. And it's not about who's older, it's who has more experience than the other. And I urge you to check it out. It's called 3 Circles of Alimat. It's a free toolkit anybody can adapt. And by the way, Alimat means female scientist in Arabic. And we published research showing the impact of this program and how it works. We published in Nature 4 different examples of other female-led initiatives that I urge you to check out. One tells stories, it's called Shahrazad. The other one is it's Ideal Society from Australia. And a 4th one is Women in Science Without Borders from Egypt. But then we come to how do we harness the potential of scientists in diaspora? And that's where I, as the president of the Society for Advancement of Science and Technology, we've created a global conference to connect scientists from their home countries with those in diaspora. so that they can share not just mentoring, resources for research, funding opportunities, and just raising awareness to science in general. And that's a potential that has not been tapped, that should be tapped if we are to produce more and more international cooperation. Then the question then becomes, so how can we do world-class science if we stay in our countries and don't do a brain drain outside our countries? And I think with COVID today, we have learned that we can network and everybody's on Zoom and you can reach out to anyone around the world and connect. And so this is a call that you reach out to others around the world, connect with them, and create international teams while you are still in your place. That doesn't mean you have to travel. And that's an opportunity, it's a silver lining to conduct that kind of research. And I wrote this article showing how to choose the right question, how when you choose the right question, people will come to you, like the famous Thomas Edison saying, build a better mousetrap, people will come to you. So that way people will come to you, want to do with you science, and you become the leader for that scientific endeavor. Not just that, it's about also for scientists who want to come to your country and want to study your local community or a certain climate change problem or an energy problem or a biology problem or a health problem, that they should work with local scientists and seek them and find them out, and not just to go in a parachute and do research and leave. And this is also a shout out to local scientists and local administrators to make sure that nobody can come into your country if they don't consult with a local scientist to do the science together. And this also leads us.
Excuse me. Okay, if you could take a minute.
I'm ending. Yeah.
Oh,
and lastly is how can we connect doing science with the sustainable development goals, right? We have to achieve them. Every country is working to achieve them. So how can we harness that to harness the potential of local scientists with international scientists to address the sustainable development goals and share those solutions and those impacts with other countries around the world? And this becomes also a resource for funding, because there's a lot of funding for the SDGs. There's a lot of funding of international NGOs coming in for development and humanitarian aid. And this is a shout out for them to work with local scientists to study the impact of the programs rather than inviting scientists from abroad or doing it in together. And now this is the last part, which is how do we do this? So yes, we have to install also policies and regulations. But if you install those policies and regulations and you don't have females on the board to interpret them in the right way, then you won't be achieving it. So you need to have quotas and have females on the board. But also you need to empower those females on the boards in the committees to have a voice, not just to tick a box that they're present, but to have an active voice in those committees. And that way you create a framework that is based on gender to encourage collaboration and freedom of speech and in pursuing intellectual curiosity that will not just serve women, it will serve all minorities anywhere they are. And with that, I remind everyone that everyone's DNA is different from anyone else. And so you're special. And if you're try to find something to do to make a difference, and it's that collective impact that makes a difference, like a drop in the ocean, and write your stories. I cannot say more about that. And remember the chaos theory. When a butterfly flutters its wings in one part of the world, it moves the wind a centimeter, that results in change beyond what we can imagine. So it's also about collective effort of every one of us going home today and trying to reach out and do something that's different. Thank you very much. And together we will address these grand challenges through interdisciplinary work, innovation, teamwork, and courage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're doing a lot of super work, and congratulations. I have to get your book and articles and read them. Absolutely. Okay, so why don't we move on to the next speaker, who I think is myself. So let me share my screen. What's going on here? Okay, there it goes. Share screen. Okay. And I have lots of things here. Okay. Okay, great. So my presentation has to do with trying to address the barriers that international colleagues face in trying to do research here in the United States. And recently I served on, my field is high energy physics. And, you know, we have these huge experiments with thousands of collaborators, like at CERN, like at Fermilab. And so you can imagine that the visa issue is extremely important for us in order to have people to flow in and out to perform their research, attend meetings. And I wanted to start with just this recent communication that I had with a world-leading researcher at one of the most prominent universities in the world, actually, and it happens to be located at the UK. And this is a researcher who had previously been a part of a big research collaboration at Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory called DUNE, which is a big neutrino experiment. And he just got so frustrated, he decided to leave that collaboration and join a similar collaboration studying neutrinos in something called the Hyper-K experiment in Japan. So he made the following statements: that the visa application black hole into which applications sink, these are applications, visas trying to come to the US to do research, into which the applications sink is known as additional administrative processing, which apparently in the internal State Department parlance also is known as security advisory opinion. And he goes on to say, I applied for a J1 visa and was interviewed on April 28th, 2023. And when I queried why I had not heard back after 6 months, I was told that it was still under the additional administrative processing. And if I queried another time, I would not get a response. So he was extremely frustrated, which is why he previously left this big experiment in the US to do his research in Japan. So I also served on the high energy physics advisory panel subpanel called the International Benchmarking Subpanel, where we studied US leadership and partnership in particle physics, which is also called high energy physics. And so we did exhaustive interviews of leaders around the world just to get their input into how easy it is and to what extent is the US a desired place to collaborate. Oh, mine is stuck. Why is that? Okay. So one of the things we do, we start out with this quote, by working together across borders, international collaborations have delivered the ideas, the instrumentation, and major facilities that have yielded groundbreaking discoveries. So that for my field of physics, I mean, international collaborations is crucial. As for collaborating across the globe, one of our key findings was that frontier research in particle physics necessitates international collaboration and cooperation. The combined expertise and resources from nations around the world enable discoveries and technological advances impossible to achieve by a single nation. It is the global particle physics program that collectively addresses the burning scientific questions across the breadth of the field. As a young physicist, I worked at Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, and the system that I worked on produced antiprotons that were sent back out to the main accelerator to collide against protons and eventually discovered the top quark. But the particular system that I worked on, called stochastic cooling, was invented by a Nobel Prize winner. He didn't have the Nobel Prize at that time, named Simon van der Meer. And, so it just shows that these international collaborations are extremely crucial. And he was at CERN, so we needed people from CERN to come and help us back and forth. At that time, we didn't have the visa problems. That was back in early 19 to mid 1980s. So you can see how essential it is in these big collaborations to have the international collaborators to come without so many visa obstacles before them. So our key recommendation was continue support for and actively seek engagement with these international collaborations and partnerships of all sizes. So we need the external input. And we want the US to be a partner of choice. We want this to be a place that people really do want to come to. So we had a key finding: success in hosting and participating in international collaborations requires tailored approaches to collaboration governance and project management, host lab environments that are conducive to international research teams, and the ability to make reliable agreements with international partners. So relative to this, not only is the visa a problem, obtaining the visas, but often when the researchers arrive, arrive at the facilities, they have difficulty, even at non-weapons laboratories like Fermilab, like at Brookhaven National Laboratory. They complain that they have to have special clearances to just go into ordinary buildings, and the buildings, you have to have clearances to go into, each type of building. So you may have to have several clearances. So it's just very difficult for our colleagues to be able to move around the lab to make their contributions. So our key recommendation is to implement structures for hosting strong international collaborations. We have to act with timeliness, concerning visas, etc., and consistently meet obligations and facilitate open communication with our partners. And there are barriers, many barriers, as I mentioned, to international participation, and they have increased over the last decade because of research security concerns, visa issues, and more restricted access to the national laboratories. Meanwhile, with those difficulties going on in the US, if you look abroad, the number of particle physics researchers in China, for instance, has doubled. And the number of researchers in Indian institutes entering the field is also growing rapidly. And these effects combine to make it increasingly challenging to recruit the best international collaborators to the US-based positions. Even for small to medium-sized experiments, the ones previously that I referred to are the huge collaborations like at Fermilab, like at CERN. But even for the smaller ones that are maybe, $1 to $10 million in order to construct, US-hosted small projects address important physics and attract significant participation from the international community, which makes valuable contributions to the projects. However, siting in the US is not always seen as an attractive option. The international community noted that it has become harder to participate in US-hosted projects than it was in the past, regardless of the scale of the project. And this is due to increased difficulties in obtaining visas and the time that it takes to do so, and increased difficulties in obtaining US laboratory access. And so we want to promote a welcoming environment, but that starts with assisting in planning visits to the host laboratories or to offsite facilities in such cases for both short and long-term visits. Support for acquiring necessary visas is essential. The US visa acquisition process is difficult, it's time-consuming, particularly for scientists of certain national origins. And the visa acquisition is currently an impediment to international collaboration, and the host labs and others must do what they can to mitigate this problem. And sort of to conclude, there are many impediments faced by US international collaborators, and these barriers hamper the whole research enterprise. And so our recommendation, one of our major recommendations, is in order to lessen the burden on international collaborators, the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation should coordinate with all relevant stakeholders, including the US Department of State, to reduce the impediments caused by agency compliance, visa delays, and on-site security. And one of the recent things that we've embarked upon was we're planning a survey, and it will be run out of the national academies and specifically through the Board on International Scientific Organizations. I have a website for that on which we've posted some suggested questions for the survey. And it would be great if you could go to this website. I'll put it in the chat to make it easier for you. If you could go to this website and read it and send me your thoughts. You may have some questions that you would like to have included, so I encourage you to do that. And with that, I conclude my presentation. I will stop sharing, and let's see. What did I do here? Let's kill this. And the next presentation. Okay, so the next presentation will be given by Professor Nikki Tiffin, who is Deputy Director of the South African National Bioinformatics Institute. Her Her work includes the integration and analysis of routine health data, epidemiological, clinical, and genomic data, as well as the ethics and governance of working with health data in research. She is a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences, and 2021 was awarded a Celestis Juma Science Leadership Fellowship by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So that's great. It's great to see that, because Celestis Juma was a professor at Harvard, and he was a good friend of mine, and I hate the fact that he passed away. But anyway, with that, I will turn it over to Professor Tiffin, whose presentation is entitled Promoting Equity Through Improved Data and Biospecimen Sharing Practices, the African Data and Biospecimen Exchange. Professor Tiffin.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation and the lovely introduction. So I'm going to be talking about a project that we are working on at this time to try and address some of the challenges we face with sharing data and biospecimens that are generated in Africa. So yeah, I'm at the National Bioinformatics Institute in South Africa at the University of the Western Cape. Right, let's just move this forward. There we go. So why should we be doing data? Is the sharing? Oh goodness. Okay, sorry, I just jumped out of that. Why should we be doing data and biospecimen sharing? I'm sure everyone is on board with this, but I think it's always nice to revisit and remind ourselves why it's important to share data and biospecimens that we collect when we're doing research. So it's really an ethical requirement. We ask a lot of participants in research. We put a lot of resources into collecting data and biospecimens, and we really are ethically obliged to use those data and biospecimens as well as we can to do as much research as possible. But of course, for human data, particularly, respecting the consents and for all data, respecting the ethical approvals that were given to use those data. So we really do need to share data and biospecimens in order to further research. We know about underrepresentation of Africans in much of the world's research that's going on, but we need to be sure that we are ethical and equitable in the processes. So there are a lot of historical inequities, and there are barriers to sharing data and biospecimens. So one of the big ones that we encounter a lot is that there's a reluctance by researchers based in Africa to send their data and biospecimens off continent. There are often funder requirements that request that data and biospecimens are sent to central repositories, central databases, and often those are not within Africa, which means that those resources end up in the jurisdiction of countries that don't necessarily have African populations and African participants as their first priority. So the other concerns are sometimes legal limitations, that national legislation means we actually can't send data and biospecimens over borders, or it's not a straightforward process. There's a risk of being scooped by better resourced labs. When you hand over the resources you've generated in African countries, if you're not extremely well capacitated, there's a good chance that you could be scooped on your major papers that you're planning to write, or the analyses you're planning to do by better resourced labs in the global north. It's also very difficult to have oversight of the onward use of data. Once they've gone into a central repository or your samples are in a central biobank, you effectively lose control over or oversight over what happens next. And it becomes harder to protect your participants' rights if you've collected those from real people. And we even see cases where researchers from Africa lose access to their own data or biospecimens. Once they get centralized, it becomes very difficult to access them for your own work again. Something else that happens a lot is that there's been a lot of change in how we do informed consent, certainly in health research and with human participants. And especially for older samples, the informed consent processes may not have been rigorous enough to determine whether participants would be comfortable with their data or biospecimens being shared further. So these kind of legacy data or legacy collections of biospecimens don't always have explicit consent for onward sharing. And then we also work with some data that are just really too sensitive. For example, in my group, we work with anonymized routine health data from real people. They are anonymized, but health data are very sensitive. And because they're anonymized data, we don't have explicit informed consent, but those data are not appropriate for spreading more widely and passing on to other researchers. Yes, I've mentioned that sometimes data are too sensitive for open sharing. A very obvious example of this is genomic data that are just completely identifying of individuals. But clinical trial data, personal health data are all really not data that we want to just make openly available with no oversight or restrictions. And then for African researchers particularly, research sustainability is an issue. So for some reason, we never I don't know anyone in Africa has ever been able to put in a mechanism for cost recoveries when they share data or biospecimens, and we don't see routine use of benefit sharing or benefit sharing agreements being put in place when data and biospecimen are shared more widely by African generators. So we're building a platform which we call the African Data and Biospecimen Exchange. And this is designed, it'll be an online platform that's designed to connect resource generators. So those are the people in Africa, the researchers who are generating data, who are generating biospecimens, and connecting those people to the consumers, the researchers who'd like to use those resources. And we want to use this to address some of the barriers I've outlined that make it harder to share data and biospecimens generated in Africa. And we really want to use a platform. It's designed to make sure that we have equitable sharing agreements and the opportunity to negotiate benefit sharing agreements with the onward use of data. And if you want to just read a document with a more detailed outline of the project, you're also welcome to just scan this little QR code and it'll take you to a more detailed document. The way the exchange works is that when somebody has a resource they want to share, let's say a data set, they can as a user go onto the platform with a validated profile, and they can essentially upload the metadata about the data set they're holding. They don't upload the actual data, they just upload the information about the resource they have to share. And then people who are looking for those kind of resources that they want to use can go and search the platform, and they can find the kinds of data or information or sample collections that they'd like to be using for their research. So it's a direct connection, but without centralizing or uploading any of the resources. So it's a really important point. We don't want any data centralized. We don't want any sample centralized. So there's no need to send the data or biospecimens away at all. Only the metadata are uploaded, and the resources stay with the researcher or the responsible institution. And only when the consumer and the generator of the resources have negotiated and agreed a transfer arrangement would there be any movement of the data or biospecimens. So this just shows you what it looks like. Maybe I've got a set of biospecimens that I'm happy to share. I can create a new listing and I can provide the basic details about what I'm holding. So for example, it's human DNA, it's from people who have a specific condition. It can be quite a basic description because we thought that lowers the barriers to being able to upload what you have. But it also, you have the option to then provide a whole lot of additional information if you would like to be more specific exactly what you have to share. And I just want to mention Dr. Eddie Lulamba in my group, who's done a lot of the work to build the ontologies behind this front end in order to be able to capture the metadata about a huge variety of different types of samples and data that might be shared. this is what the search page looks like. So maybe I'm another researcher who's looking for resources to share. I can go and search with a whole lot of filters and keywords and get a list of potential resources to share. And then when I see something I like, I can click on it, read a little bit more about it. And if I decide I want to contact that researcher, I can start a chat and send a message to the researcher holding that resource I want to use. And then we can have a discussion. Oh, I really like your data set. Would you be willing for me to use it for this thing? Well, yeah, that thing's okay. Can we involve our master's student in your research so we can learn that technique? However the chat goes. And it could be as simple as, I'd really like to use your data set. Sure, no problem. Show me your ethics approval and then I'll send it on to you. So it's really a two-way negotiation between the resource generator, the resource consumer, and they can come to their own terms and conditions. We're also trying to encourage different ways of sharing instead of just the simple, I've got something, I give it to you, and that's the end of the story. We're also looking at collaborative research. Let's work on this together. Let's combine our data or our biospecimens, and also federated analysis. And this is particularly of interest when you have these kind of legacy data sets. I can't give you my data, or I can't give you my biospecimens, but we can work together. You do the analysis on yours, I'll do the analysis on mine, and we'll work together to join our findings without ever actually sharing the resources. So we've got a paper out which kind of describes all these different ways of sharing to try and broaden our idea of how sharing might work. Once you've agreed how you're going to do the sharing through the chat, then we have a data sharing agreement builder. And this prompts you step by step to make sure you put the right clauses in your data sharing agreement between the two of you. It's kind of like an MOU. It's not going to be a legally constituted document because it's really not possible to do that for every possible legal jurisdiction in which people are living. But what it does do is it provides a very detailed MOU. And then this, at this point, if you want to, you can also invite into this platform your legal representative, your tech transfer office, and build a fit for purpose detailed MOU about what you've agreed in your informal chatting. And just to mention, Dr. Tsauneta Mukhla from my group, who's been working on this piece of the data sharing agreements and how we're putting it together. So just to wrap up, this is our progress to date. We spent actually a year working with our user experience team and developers, and we built a detailed specification with that lovely front end that I've demoed and then, or that I've shown you. And we had a really great stakeholder workshop in Entebbe in 2023. The developers are working currently, and we're looking at a completion date for June 2024. We're very excited to release it. We'll certainly be sharing the information more widely. And this is just to acknowledge, obviously, the very generous funding through the Callistus Juma Fellowship from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then our partners outside the group are Hominem Global, who did our user interface and user testing work, and Method Lab, our software development team. Thanks. Back over to you.
Yes. Thank you so much. So you also are doing just great work. My goodness, I didn't whip my camera out fast enough to get that Q code, but we can make it available after the webinar is over with.
I'll pop it in the chat as well. Thank you. Okay,
great, fantastic. Okay, so let's see. Moving on. So next we will hear from Professor Arukanoke Panraksa, and she's a policy specialist in the field of intellectual property laws at Technology Licensing Office of the National Science and Technology Development Agency in Thailand. She has been playing a key role to form a policy framework to promote and strengthen technology licensing offices and IP professionals in the academic and research institutions in her home country of Thailand. Her presentation is on intellectual property rights and international scientific collaborations. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Panraksa.
Thank you so much, Professor Sikasi. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to meet everyone this morning of yours or your afternoon or the evening in Southeast Asia. And first of all, I would like to thank IAP and Nassim for having me joining this panel. And I'm further lucky to give a talk after Professor Nikki because her topic is quite relevant to my expertise. And I learned that all the panelists are scientists, and then when you meet a lawyer, you might not feel comfortable, but somehow when we talk about intellectual property rights, that's something that I love to share you my practice where I have been working with scientists back in Thailand. And so I just try to simplify the whole process within one slide. This is going to be only one slide that I have today. And so let's put it this way. Whenever we work on a research project, I believe that most of researchers will focus merely on your own research proposal and focus on your teamwork, the expertise that you would like to partner with kind of limitation to focus on other elements, including legal matters. So today you will see that the whole value chain when we are working on a research collaboration. Despite you're working with your own territory, your own country, or at the regional level or international level, somewhat the format will be somewhat similar one way or another. What I have highlighted in red are often the issues that occur during my career providing advice to our researchers. So let me kick off by saying when you develop your own proposal, you find the research partners, right? And like Professor Tiffin had just addressed about her own specimen project that deal with, in this regard, she focused on the data and specimen, biospecimen, right? But that may or may not be subject to the protection of intellectual property rights. So the objective and goals of the project must be really clear. And then when you're gonna help developing this proposal, the kind of project proposal, it's also important for you to think about the policy that is relevant to your project. For example, are you applying for any funding agencies outside your country or within your country? So it's important to check with the IP condition from their funding agency. And also within your own institution, whether you have the institutional IP policy or not. So what I'm going through here is more like the experience reflecting from the practice from the global south. Oftentimes I find that the IP ownership is the most critical issues. And as I mentioned earlier, that researchers barely take a look at the legal document. You wouldn't really pay attention of who owns what. And so with that, there will often be the issue afterwards, and it's going to be my tax or our office, because I work for the technology licensing office serving almost 1,000 scientists at the National Science and Technology Development Agency. So with that in mind, so we see that ownership is one of the key issues. Once you start negotiating with your research partners, you have to think about the collaboration part, the second column here. What is the scope of your project, the roles and responsibility of your party or your part? Because when you jump into this kind of collaboration, you may have to think about if you come with any background IP, meaning before you enter into any collaboration, do you have any intellectual property rights before jumping in? This is something you need to claim clearly before you join this kind of project. And during the project itself, it should also be clearly spelled out who owns what. Because you have heard Professor Tiffin mentioning about her project, right? And I would like to address like there are the issues of the data management, the knowledge and know-how management, and intellectual property rights management. All set of these will be managed slightly different. But when we talk about intellectual property rights, it's more or less like the territory basis. And therefore, it's important for you to really agree and discuss with your own partners clearly who's going to be doing what. And most importantly, and when you talk about patent in particular, it's quite costly. It may, the cost may be vary from one country to another, but it's important to be kind of clearly spelled out who's going to be paying for what. And once you your project kick off, and you may have to start monitor what comes out of your project. Is there any kind of room of improvement of the project that you have been working together with your partners? If that is the case, do you have the right to work on the top of such kind of joint project? So what I would like to address down at the bottom of this slide, I address the issue of the ownership. That is the most critical part, because it will tell you, your institution, your own lab, whether you have the right to do what, right? And then because in my office, we often deal with patent. So inventorship is another issue that gives us a big headache, because to identify who is the actual inventors is also critical, because you are, when you have the research project proposal, it doesn't mean that everyone, every names within your proposal would be eligible to be named as inventors. But those who would be named within the patent application need to contribute and comply with the patent law. And when it comes to agreement, we learned from again Professor Nikki that when you deal with the biological materials, it's so important that you need to make sure that you handle with the proper documents and agreement. For example, if you need to disclose any sensitive information, the non-disclosure agreement or NDA should be put in place. Or if you need to transfer any sample material to your partner, so material technology, material transfer agreement or MTA is also important. And once you're done with your own project, but you might also need to double check, is there other obligation within your research collaboration? For example, if you come up with any potential subject matter that could be commercializable, what are the benefits you would like to agree? So these elements of the ownership, the right to manage the outcome of the joint collaborative research, and also the benefit sharing need to be spelled out. I have emphasized this kind of few terms many times, because oftentimes you find out that we need to help cover up all the mistakes that our scientists often made, because whenever you receive any funding, you are really happy to jump into it without taking a look of kind of the conditions that come with the agreements. And more importantly, when the project is over, and if you want to go to the next phase of the project, you might feel regret later on, because you might not be able to kind of make certain improvement because of the obligation under the previous agreement of the former project. So this is something that it has been ongoing, and in particular in Southeast Asia. But when we work with, in particular with the high income countries, it's important that you take all these points into consideration just to make sure that it's going to be a win-win kind of project and you will be happily working with your partners. I think I will pause my talk for the time being, and because if any of you have experienced something slightly different, you can share with me, or you could post the question during the Q&A session. With that, I turn the floor back to Professor Sekasi.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that exceptional presentation. And I hope that you will be willing and the other speakers to share your slides after the webinar is over. Of course, the webinar itself is being recorded so that it will be available. Okay, with that, why don't we turn it over to questions and answers? Let's see. I don't see any questions. Can you put your questions in the chat, please? Or, I mean, we have a small group. If you want to raise your hand, that would be even better. Okay. Any hands raised?
Sekasi, I raised my hand, but it's very pale. I know that it cannot be seen.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, I see. Right, I see. Okay, I see you. Okay. Go ahead, Rana.
Thank you very much, Sekasi, and thank you to all the speakers. Fascinating presentations, and we touched on a lot of issues related to international mobility and sharing of science across different countries, different continents. My question was triggered by your presentation, Sekasi. The solution lies, at least in the United States, with many different entities. It's not just the State Department. It's the Department of Homeland Security. You mentioned NSF, the National Science Foundation, NIH, the National Institutes of Health would have a stake on this. So how can you convince all of these entities about the problem when the agencies care about different aspects, security versus science versus other things, to come up with a single solution, or maybe solutions? I don't expect it to be a single solution, but can you talk a little bit about that complexity?
Yes, that's a great question. And to answer it, I think I could get a PhD dissertation out of it. But I think that the thing is, first of all, to just know to what extent we have this problem, and that's the purpose of the survey. We need to study, just the hard numbers and comments. As I mentioned from that international benchmarking panel that I served on, we interviewed leaders of major collaborations around the world, and we heard so many comments to the effect, many of my colleagues don't even want to go to the US anymore. They just avoid it, right? So in addition to having people who are trying to come, like the gentleman, I shouldn't have said, at least you know the sex of the person. He was concerned just about, he actually had engaged with a collaboration, but just gave up because of the difficulties. So we need to try to get a comprehensive study with hard data on precisely what the problems are, and to try to compose it in some type of a nice summary package, and then take that to the various agencies, State Department, NSF, DOE, and the others, to try to see if we can have some dialogue as to how to go about solving it. So definitely it's a complicated problem, but it's one that I think we have to get started to work on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we also have Mohammed Asiam Beg. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Sekasi. I think you have made very nice recommendations. And if we could follow it through, I think there are so many people who are really suffering from this issue. I can quote a couple of examples from my students. They were given financial support for 6 months to spend time in the US, but the visa problem was taking a long time. And I think this issue has to be discussed among the academicians And I'm sure we might find a way out of this one. I think as science has no boundaries, and scientists should be made freely movable. I don't know how to get that kind of status that we can exchange visits among different countries. Last week, we invited our very good friend, Malik Maza from South Africa. So he came here to Pakistan and we had a 1 week, very, very fruitful, where we discussed a lot of things. So these boundaries can be really broken, provided some authorities give some sort of support. Thank you very much. And I would like to congratulate the first speaker from Jordan, Rana Tejani. I think she has done a wonderful job. I appreciate the work she has been doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comments. If you could send me, you have my email. I put it in the chat. If you could send me that experience that your students and others have had and difficulties trying to obtain the visa, that would be very helpful. And there are a lot of problems. One problem I did not mention, you have people who are, for instance, students or postdocs or people working here who they want to go home, but they're afraid to leave because of the visa issue. So that's another problem that we have. So there are just so many problems connected with the whole visa issue. So, okay, thank you so much for that question. Is there another hand raised? I don't see another hand. And I don't see any in the chat. Hold on, wait a minute.
Can we ask
Let me
a
read
question?
one here that yes, go ahead, Dr. Panra.
Yes, I have a question to Professor Tiffin, because I'm very interested in hearing the experience of in an African continent, because in Southeast Asia we also deal with loss of biodiversity and some biospecimen, and I believe that our system is not well established as yours of what you have demonstrated. So most of the time when we do the prior informed consent, like those pick and match, so it's still in the form of the paper-based, not in the kind of proper system like what you have. But in your kind of former experience, have you encountered any kind of challenges when you have to deal with transfer of the biological materials overseas, and how did you kind of overcome that?
Thank you for the question. Sorry, I can only speak for the South African experience because that's where I'm working currently. So we do have fairly formalized processes. It's a bit time consuming. It is possible logistically to move samples, excuse me, once you have a material transfer agreement. What has been interesting, we have a new Protection of Personal Information Act, and it's not legal to move identifying data across borders without specific informed consent. And genomic data is seen as obviously personally identifying. So it means that you can't sequence a whole lot of individuals and then share their sequence with an international collaborator unless you have a clearly signed document where it's obvious and explicit that the participant has understood that you'll be sending their genomic data out of the country and that they're okay with it. So you need to have that clearly documented. And that's caused a lot of consternation for researchers here. They're not altogether happy, or they don't altogether accept that that's what the Act means. But that is what the Act means. So there are, I think the answer is really about when we're working with humans, human participants, is really being very intentional at the informed consent and consultation and participant information stage. And if you do that well, then there aren't barriers to moving biospecimens if your participants have understood what you're doing and they agree to it, and that's clearly documented. So there are the two levels. The one is the kind of logistical, and that's if you've got the informed consent and the ethics approval and the samples obviously are safe enough to be moved around, logistically with a material transfer agreement, authorized by the government, that's feasible. But the other side is the ethics and the protection of personal information and identifiable material. That is another layer. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Sorry, I'm not sure if that's the information that you're after.
Is that okay? Okay. Why don't we move on to the next question? I see a question in the chat from Melissa Wu. She says, we see a lot of funding agencies such as TWAS, the World Academy of Sciences, that try to encourage cross-border collaborations by funding one or more entities. Are there specific barriers you'd note that make that kind of funding difficult for researchers to use, or recommendations to facilitate the collaboration? It's great to have these cross-border funding grants, but they still have to bow down to the visa, the visa requirements. So, I think that the kind of thing that we're trying to do in the U.S., speaks to that kind of problem. I also see where Professor Tiffin mentions that they also have problems in South Africa. Funding people getting visas to travel and come to South Africa. So this is a problem throughout the world. It's just that from our point of view, we're just trying to solve it in our countries, and I hope all of you do make progress solving it in your countries, but it's a problem. There's a project called LAMP that I chair, Light Sources for Africa, the Americas, Asia, Middle East, and Pacific. We send faculty and students to synchrotron light source facilities for training. And that's one, we have a lot of visa issues, of course, relative to that. And there's one in particular that we still are trying to work out the problems, and it's been a year now. So these are serious, and that has nothing to do with the U.S. Okay, this is a serious problem everywhere. So, okay, we have. I'm sorry, Professor Tiffin.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought I would also chip in not only on the visa issue, maybe for Melissa's question, because she's asked, are there specific barriers you'd note that make that kind of funding difficult for researchers to use, or recommendations to facilitate the collaboration? And I would just suggest, my interest is obviously on doing more equitable science. So we see a lot of global North, global South collaborations where the global North partners tend to have the control of the funding, let's say, because that's the way funders often prefer to disperse the funding. And they set up terribly inequitable power differentials. And then we also have a lot of problems. We call it helicopter science, where people from the global North have the money, they come in, they collect the samples and the data, and they leave. And you see a few African authors buried in the middle of your collaboration, your publications somewhere. So I'm not sure if it's the area you were asking in, but I think the recommendations to facilitate the collaboration, if you want happy partners when you deal with global South partners, I think it's really essential to include your global South partners as equal authors. I mean, to really interrogate whether you need to move the samples and the data to the global North partners, or if you're going to collect data, I speak for Africa, in Africa, can you do the analysis and the write-up and all of those things in Africa with the African researchers? So we really see this, really some fairly terrible practices where the African researchers become kind of glorified sample collectors. And it sounds like something that, people were flagging in the 80s, but I can assure you it's still a very common and alarming practice that continues. So in terms of how to facilitate the collaborations, I think having equal partnerships and respecting the fact that if you're working with people in their home countries, collecting samples and data from their home countries, that you should be situating your analysis and paper writing there too. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And I think Peter McGrath would like to make a comment from the TWAS.
Yes, thank you for that. And apologies to Kemi Tope for maybe jumping ahead of the queue. As the question from Melissa sort of referenced TWAS, I was the TWAS program officer some years ago before moving to IAP, and we're still in the same building together. So certainly some years ago, we set up a grant system. So in addition to the young scientists grants that we were giving at the time and the support for research groups, we wanted to promote the idea of research consortia, which are sort of very strong in the European Union. This was our model, and people moving around between different labs. Maybe we were a little ahead of our time because we got very, very few applications, and I don't think we even ever awarded more than 1 or 2 of those research consortia. Since I moved to IAP, I understand that the conditions have improved, and the research consortia were starting to move again with laboratories across borders working together, and students and researchers finding it much more easy to collaborate with one another. So certainly it's certain parts of Africa, especially between neighboring countries, the situation has improved over the past few years. There are also TWAS programs that bring people to Europe, especially from sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm not aware of any major difficulties with those. Possibly, I mean, the one we have with sending postdoc researchers to Germany is through the DFG, the German Research Foundation, and presumably they have a connection to help smooth the visa process. But certainly when there are other short-term visits for workshops and meetings, events, then it's the visa issue, bringing people to Europe especially, can be almost a lottery. And it takes a lot of work for our colleagues in TWAS working directly with Italian embassies in different countries to try and assist and encourage, and even getting the appointments and ensuring that we are bona fide organizations, all this sort of thing. There's a lot of hands-on work that is needed to smooth that visa process. But yes, visas is a very hit and miss affair. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So why don't we turn it over to Timmy Topit, Sakbanu?
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. And it's nice that I'm speaking immediately after Peter, because I think one way or the other, the German process has been a bit more better, at least in my own experience. I have had opportunity to go on research fellowships to Germany on DFG, and also an institutional-based fellowship. And the visa process was highly facilitated through a lot of hands-on work that I realized with the institutions, or in the case of DFG, with DFG and I think the consulate or so. It's not clear for me because the visa issue is a very big challenge. I do realize even across and within Africa. For instance, I have a colleague, a senior lecturer, widely traveled across other countries. She's just going to the US for 9 months, and her visa was, application was rejected. She had post letters, she had everything. And it just wasn't clear what could have been the reason for that. She had evidence of funds for the period. She had evidence that it was a national funded project and things like that. And my challenge, I'm an affiliate of the Academy of Sciences and a member of the Nigerian Young Academy. And my thought has been that when you have faculty members, especially who are in such high profile academies, there ought to be some way that such academies can interface with the consulates to facilitate the visa process for at least people like that who are quite highly for the mobility of such researchers who are moving. I mean, for some of us, for instance, in the past 2-3 weeks, I've been going in and out within the country and out of the country. And the major issue for me has just been the visa. You can literally spend 50–70% of your time for a research collaboration, pursuing visas, spending money and things like that, and losing very quality time to do work. I really hope that the IAP at this level and maybe in consortium with other academics can support that. I'm even talking for faculty members. So you can now imagine students who are just starting out and who don't have, a pedigree yet, how difficult it is for them to have such mobilities, when you have, large consortia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Any other questions? I'd like to ask, actually, Professor Tiffin, if you could say a few words about the status of women within the whole bioinformatic community in South Africa.
Thank you. That sounds like a loaded question. I'm a bit nervous. So I can happily
it's not your topic, but
no, I can happily say that that we are. It's fairly gender balanced. I think in general, and I'm not speaking with the strength of any specific figures behind me. I'm just venturing a personal opinion from what I've observed. I think often we are still male heavy at the top and leadership positions. And that, we in the research environment, health sciences and biological sciences research environment, we still don't have enough women who've made it from the sort of slightly lower levels up to the very top leadership roles. So I think it's still not a well-balanced pyramid in that sense. But overall, I think women are generally well represented. And yeah, we're fighting all the time to be visible and to support. We're very conscious of it in our numbers when we're bringing in new students, when we're bringing in new faculty. That's a very big part of what we look at to try and make sure that things are balanced and fair. So it's not perfect, but it's not as imperfect as it is in many other places. Yeah. So, yeah.
And also, as far as the ethnic diversity goes, I know, I do a lot of work in South Africa, and we're constantly trying to increase the number of Black scientists and engineers in various projects. What is your impression as to, have the mobility gates been opened more and more, or what is the present state of affairs?
Yeah, so it depends which university you're at. So I'm at the University of the Western Cape. So in a way, so the university, and for the wider audience, of course, there's a history in South Africa of segregation. It feels like it was a long time ago, but I think in historical terms, it wasn't that long ago. And some universities, were previously assigned to particular subgroups of the population. So my university was historically a non-white university, and it just means that it is fully transformed and fully representative to date. So it's less of an issue. Other universities that were historically white, sorry, did I say mine was historically non-white, that were historically white universities? Personally, I think they've still got a way to go. I'm not always happy with what I see in the spaces of some South African universities in terms of not trying hard enough to ensure that diversity is being encouraged, perhaps. I'm trying to put this in a way that's not going to get me ostracized by anyone in my community. But yeah, let's say it's not perfect and it's very varied. And let me maybe also say it in a positive way. I'm extremely happy to be at the University of the Western Cape, where I think it's not an issue at all. And then also just to say, we have also really a lot of fantastic students and fantastic researchers. So all the way from master's, PhD, and then of course up to our faculty level researchers who all come from different African countries. And that is a really nice dynamic as well, because it's just a fantastic boost to our skills, diversity, and competencies. So that's also, I mean, I'm Zimbabwean, so I'm also not South African. I'm also a visiting African in that sense, although I've been in South Africa for a long time. So I think that we have a really interesting, culturally, intellectually diverse population in the universities, and that's a very rich experience. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, you did a great job. Didn't mean to put you on the
Thanks.
spot. Okay,
I
so
know
let
it's
me.
going to throw me under a bus after this.
So let us take the last question from Flannery Wesson from the academies.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to join in as part of the board on international scientific organizations at the academies in the US. As part of the International Visitors Office, we've been tracking visas and scientific visas for over 2 decades. I came into the International Visitors Office in 2020 as things began to shut down globally. And I would just like to share from that perspective of the data that we collect that we continue to see people who have put very thoughtful applications forward, who have connected in very meaningful ways globally to positions that can only be filled by their expertise. Again, finding a swift end to their cases in the United States. We provide assistance to those who are attempting to gain a visa. And we often find people in the very situations that you're talking about, Sakazi, with administrative processing being a space that just ends this process. So I just wanted to join in and say that we do track this data. It's not something that the academies can step in and assist with, but we are allies to those who are applying, and that we keep track of it. And when I'm able to reach out to the State Department, I do find that the most pressing issue is just administrative backlog and lack of staff able to handle the load that exists. So thank you, Rania, for mentioning for me to just say a quick word, but I wanted to note that we are a resource for those who are trying. If you ever need to log your case with us, it would be at the International Visitors Office, which I can link. And we are finding in particular, even conferences are going to be very difficult to get people into the US. One space is visa interviews, which of course you can look up data to see how long of a wait time it is. But even when you do get a visa interview, oftentimes those are a year beyond the date of the event. And there's just nothing that can be done due to the lack of staff available to process these interviews. So those are some of the things that we track. If you have other unique cases or you'd like to discuss anything further, or just continue the conversation with details that you think would be relevant to us, I will leave our email and also the survey in the chat. And thank you for this important perspective.
Okay, thank you so much, Flannery. So at this point, we will turn it over to our leader, Dr. Rania Costi, who is the Executive Director of the International Scientific, of the Inter-Academy Partnership, and also the Director of the Academy's International Scientific Organizations Office. So with that, turn it over to her, as well as to Moses Aguto, who has been handling all of this logistics. He's an Associate Program Officer working with Dr. Costi. With that, I will turn it over to you, Ronnie.
Thank you very much, Sakazi. But of course, I see you and Stephanie, who opened the webinar, as the leaders, and not me. I want to thank all the speakers and all the participants for being here today. We touched on a number of issues. Visas was one, but also the issues of intellectual property and sharing of biospecimens and other sensitive information. It's a complicated problems probably, with not a single solution, definitely not a single solution that would fit all nations. But I feel that networks like ours, the Inter-Academy Partnership, together with the Board on International Scientific Organizations, are in good, and the unions, of course, the respective unions, are in a good position to have these discussions and start engaging with the decision makers. And I think as we collect more data, this should be proof enough for policy makers to understand that it impedes science globally, these issues of mobility. Again, thank you very much. And I want to give the final word to Moses, who put all of this together to close the meeting.
Thanks, Rania. I think we've had a very wonderful discussion. Thanks to you all for participants for attending, and most importantly to our speakers, really for the insightful conversation. These webinars happen quarterly, and please look out in the next 2 or 3 months when I send out invitation for the second one for the year. I'd also like to mention that the webinar has been recorded, and in the next few weeks, we will share with you the recording, which we usually put on the IAP YouTube channel. So again, thank you very much, everyone. And I think the webinar, I'd like to declare it over.